Welcome to Equilibrium Echoes, the podcast where we delve into the transformative power of your inner world on your relationships. I'm your host, Alyssa Decker. Join me as we unlock the secrets of emotional equilibrium and dig deep into the tools and insights needed to foster healthier, more fulfilling relationships in ways that feel safe and authentic. Welcome back to Equilibrium Echoes. I'm your host, Alyssa Decker, and today I am thrilled to be bringing you another fabulous guest. Our guest today is here to talk about something that I think is going to really hit home for all of us in one way or another, whether we are male or female. But the focus of the conversation today is going to be on emotional intelligence for men specifically, how we develop it, why it's important, how it plays out in our lives, all the things. And we're really going to tackle this topic from the perspective of someone who has been in the trenches working with men on this very topic, and hopefully dispel a few myths that are often tossed around as well when it comes to what emotional intelligence really looks like. So I'd like to welcome to the podcast Michael Alaya-White from Wayward Coaching. Michael, take it away. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. So I am the founder of Wayward Coaching. I am a trauma-informed certified coach, which means I work with people who are looking to improve themselves. And also the certification allows me to work with people that have experienced trauma, traumatic events, and have some of that potentially stored up in their body. I'm also a certified inner child recovery specialist as well, which means I work with men to go back through their stories to figure out where did it go wrong, where are the pain points and the events that caused specific disconnections in emotional intelligence and things like that. And then how do we proceed from there to process that and move forward toward the future. And so I'm thrilled to be here.
Yes, I'm so glad you're here. I think this is such a fascinating topic. And one thing that jumped out immediately at me on what you said is this work of this inner child work and the emotional intelligence work. Like those two things are very interconnected, aren't they?
I would say they are. In all of the men that I've worked with, and then in my own personal journey of being someone who had to recover emotional intelligence, now I believe that I was actually born with it, and then through trauma and other things, lost it along the way. And I've recovered some of it since, and I'm still processing and growing in that. A lot of the men that I've worked with and a lot of my friends in this recovery process, most of them did not engage their stories at a depth of actually going back and seeing, okay, this is what happened to me, neglect, abuse, abandonment, whatever, and here's how I responded to that environment and to those situations to survive. But in that process, I stopped developing emotion. There's almost like a pause button that's pressed because of these events that happen. And so while I'm turning 34, I would say that up until 5 years ago, I was probably in my teens emotional at best.
I've heard that. I've heard it said, and tell me if I'm saying this wrong or interpreting this wrong, but I've heard it said that very often if you're looking at someone's emotional intelligence, the level of emotional intelligence that you currently have is, unless you've done this work, it often kind of pauses at a moment of some sort of trauma or some sort of traumatic event in our lives. Is that accurate, would you say?
I would say, yeah. So a couple things about that. It pauses the growth at that level, and it also attaches, or in some ways imprints that experience so deeply on who you are that as you grow up, when you find yourself in similar environments, whether that's chaos, abuse, neglect, perceived abandonment, that memory gets activated and you respond like you did back then. And so I'm in my late 20s, early 30s when I'm figuring this out, realizing I'm responding like a teenager. My brain is fully developed. My prefrontal cortex has developed at this point. because it's normally mid to late 20s, depending on male or female. But I'm responding like someone half my age. And it's because of these events and these experiences that pause this emotional growth where I'm going, I don't know a different way to respond. I just know this isn't healthy. I'm starting to gain awareness to like, this is not good. Like, I'm not responding like the way I feel I should as an adult. And so part of that is going back into the story and finding those pain points, processing them, for me with a trauma therapist. And all of a sudden I start responding differently. And it takes time because you're growing, but I'm like, wait, I can handle situations like that now, and they still make me upset or sad, but they're not crippling like they used to be.
Right, right. So I have a comment about that, but I want to pause just for a second and have you give us a definition of emotional intelligence. Like, let's just make sure we're super clear on the terminology that we're using here and how we're defining it.
Okay. Emotional. I thought this might happen. I was thinking about this earlier. I'm like, so emotional intelligence. Okay. I'm trying to figure out how to boil this down because it's such a in my mind, it's such a multi-layered thing. Emotional intelligence is okay, if I had to boil it down, this is actually really good for me. Thank you for doing this because I need to do this. I would say it's twofold. And people obviously may disagree. I would say that it is the growing self-awareness of your internal world and the growing capability to communicate that externally. That's a sloppy definition, but it's growing awareness of what's going on inside my head, my heart, and I would argue through what's called polyvagal theory, my gut, because the gut is associated with safety and protection, and there's all sorts of feelings and sensations that happen in there. So it's a growing awareness of what's going on inside. But I also think that part of emotional intelligence is the ability to communicate that, to get it out. Because once you learn what's inside, now you got to offload some of that, because chances are you've been carrying it for a while. So that's what I would say is it's the growing self-awareness of the internal world and a growing capability of communicating that externally.
I like that definition. I like that a lot. Do you think there's also an aspect of emotional intelligence that is how we relate to other people, how we pick up or perceive other people's emotions and interpret those?
So I would like to add to my definition. Number 3 is what's called attuning, which is what you just described. It's the ability to attune to someone else. And I would argue that it's very difficult to attune to someone else when you can't even attune to yourself, when you don't know what's going on. It's hard to actually relate to. You can see things, but to actually be able to emotionally connect, if you're not connected with yourself, it's very difficult to connect. So yes, thank you for saying that. That's such an important part, is attuning.
Well, I think the reason I love your first 2 points to your definition is I think sometimes we get stuck on that third point and we think that's all there is to it. Mm-hmm. But what you're actually saying here in the way that you're defining this is that a very large percentage of emotional intelligence is what happens internally inside of us. And then there is also an external relationship communication bit to it, but that's not really the root of it.
No. And as we talked about yesterday, as you bring this up, the concept of staying with the guys I work with, staying on their side of the street, where I'm like, man, you got enough stuff over here that I promise you that if you clean up this that's taking up all your energy, that energy's still going to be there. Now we can redirect that to attuning to your partner across the street. But you're so consumed subconsciously with all this stuff that's going on, you don't even know until we talk about it and your awareness is raised to like, oh my gosh, this has all been here. And now I'm becoming aware of it. We clear some of that up. Now we can attune properly to your partner, to your kids, to your coworkers, to whoever. And you have energy and capacity to actually do that.
Yes, exactly. So I see in my coaching practice, I coach women in high conflict relationships, work on better strategies for coping in those relationships, different ways of showing up in those relationships. what I hear so often from them is like, he doesn't even know how to give me what I need. He doesn't even know how to emotionally connect with me. And I think that's not picking on women. That's just, or men. That's just contextually where I am and what I hear. But what I think where we go so wrong in this conversation is what you hear all the time on social media is this very limited piece. Like emotional intelligence is understanding what your wife's really communicating. It's emotionally connecting with her. It's this, it's that. So that underlying piece is so critical because you can't have the connection with other people piece if you don't have the internal work piece.
Yes. And I think that's a very good point. I think you bring that up. What's really important about that is it's one thing when the partner can see the man trying, going, okay, there's an attempt here. There's another level of love and connection when it flows, when it becomes who the person is. And part of that is due to the internal work that they've cleaned up their side of the street.
Mm-hmm.
Chances are there's a lot of stuff on there that they didn't put as a kid. And then they became an adult and became responsible for their own decisions and added to the mess that was already there. And so it's the sad reality, particularly for addiction, trauma, and emotional intelligence, is that it's harder to get out than it was to get in. Because you didn't have control of your environment when you were a kid. You didn't choose a lot of the stuff that happened to you, and then you became an adult and made decisions that you're responsible for. And so you're going to have to do the work that isn't fair in some ways to clean up stuff that wasn't even yours to begin with, that was passed on to you. But I promise you, as that clears, attunement becomes possible, and it actually can become a part of you. Because you are now attuned to what's going on inside of you, and now you can connect with someone else naturally. Not just by going, I know my wife needs this, or I know my partner needs this, which is good. You're trying to attempt, that's good. But it's going to flow because you have capacity to do it.
Yes. And we can, when we do the work in us, because, okay, before we do the work, oftentimes we're very focused on what the mess on the other person's side of the street, right? Because we feel like, man, if they would just clean up their stuff, this relationship would be so much better. Mm-hmm. But once we do the work and we clean up our side of the street, what I find is that then we are so much more capable of loving and connecting and supporting the other person regardless of their mess. It's like their mess is still there or may still be there, but it doesn't have the same impact on us that it did.
That's right.
Previously.
And a lot of that is because of the subconscious energy that we are actually projecting. It's what's called spot it, you got it. It's one of the terms my friend uses where it's just so brilliant, where he's like, anytime I see something in someone else that drives me nuts, it's probably because I haven't. And project, it's a brilliant phrase where he said it and I'm like, dude, that is it. Like, I resonate with that so deeply. And what it is it's a projection of like, if they would just clean up their side of the street. And there's some validity to some of that for sure, because no one's perfect.
Right.
But it's so easy to get tunnel vision on what's going on over there when it's like there's stuff all around us on our side of the street that if we spent the energy there, we would be far less agitated.
Right. And taking responsibility for what's on our side of the street is the first step. So I want to circle back to something you were talking about in your own personal journey when you suddenly had this moment of realizing, like, I'm showing up like a teenager here. That's huge, right? But that's a place where a lot of us never get on our own. So what did that look like for you? How did you get there? And kind of tell me what that looked like in your own life.
Yeah. So for many of us, unfortunately, the best teacher is pain. And I wish that wasn't true in my story in some ways, but it is. And so I really had to get to the point in 2019 where my life just fell apart. I have gifts that are external in terms of being able to talk and speak in front of a lot of people, and did a lot of nonprofit and faith type work. But my internal world was a disaster, and I had no idea or language to get it out. And so I first started to notice in my mid-20s, something's wrong. I don't know what it is, but something is just off. Like, this cannot be it. Like, I don't think I can go on like this for the next 50, 60 years if I make it. And so I knew something was off. And then as stress increased, as responsibilities and in some ways influence for me increased, I had no idea how to regulate my emotions. So addiction comes in to help me escape, to help my stress level come down, to help me feel better. All of these things. Underneath all of that is trauma, right? And so all this is spinning around. And for me, it reached a breaking point in 2019 where I just fell apart. And from that point, it honestly was the best thing that could have happened to me, because I really had to ask the questions that I didn't want to ask and talk about things that I didn't know how to talk about. So I'll give you one example. Winter of 2019, beginning of 2020, I went to a counseling intensive with 5 other guys I never met. And we sat in this circle, and there was a sheet of paper laminated on the floor, and it had 8 emotions: anger, hurt, lonely, sad, fear, shame, guilt. And we're going around the room. The guy's like, the clinician gets to me. He's like, "What are you feeling?" And I'm like, "I don't know." And he literally points to the sheet of paper. He's like, "Pick one." And I looked him dead in the eye. I'm like, I am not in kindergarten. Like, I was upset because I'm like, I'm not a child. But emotionally, to be fair to him, I actually really was closer to a child than not. And so I got upset, and he's like, "Oh, so you're angry?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah." And for the first time in my life, I started to learn language on how to get what was inside outside. And it launched me on this journey where I'm like, I've never heard another man say that he was hurt, but I am very hurt. Never heard another man say that he was lonely, but I am hella lonely because of this trauma that happened to me. So all of this stuff started to come out, and it was like toxic waste was coming out of me, and there was more space to heal, to feel, and to be real. Like, as funny as that cliche is, like, to actually be alive. And so my awareness from that point of really things falling apart and the pain caused me to ask questions I wouldn't normally ask. And so the whole purpose of why I do trauma-informed coaching now is to try to be a lighthouse for guys, where I'm like, hey, you're going to have to navigate some really difficult waters because life is hard, but I want to shine a light on these rocks around here so that you don't shipwreck your life. That's the whole point. You're going to have to sail through difficult waters. That's just life. But you don't have to leave a wake of destruction like I did. And so that's the whole point, is to try to help them raise awareness and be curious about who they are. Because typically guys in addiction have so much toxic shame that they don't have room for curiosity. The shame drowns out the curiosity. But the answers you're looking for are found in your story, which implies that you need to be curious. So for me, it was the pain. The pain was great enough where I started to ask questions I didn't normally ask.
So in this process, did you have examples of people, men especially around you, who you could look at and go, okay, that's where I'm headed, right? That's where I'm going. That's what this can look like. Or did you just sort of have to figure it out on your own as you went along?
Yeah. So you asked very good questions. I'm very thankful for it. I remember coming back from that counseling intensive, and I was on cloud 9 because I was like, I got this thing figured out. No, I didn't.
I'm laughing because I've been there and I know where this is headed. Keep going.
Yeah. So I didn't. Long story short, surprise, I didn't. But what he said to me was so profound, and he was really the example for me for a couple of years because I didn't have him. I was looking for him, and I'm like, this is so bizarre. Like, I see the world so differently now, and all the people that I'm around don't have this language and don't talk like this. But he said, now that you're on this journey, you're going to experience a different type of loneliness. And I was like, nah, dude, like, these people are going to love it. And he was right. So for 2 years, I stumbled around trying to figure out, like, okay, where do I belong? Where are my people? Like,
Mm-hmm.
where do I connect into? And then in 2022, after a couple of years of stumbling around and still not being able to figure out what's going on, growth, but a lot of just trauma issues, I got connected with a place in Colorado and went there for 2 weeks, met 9 guys from around the country, and we fought for each other's souls for 2 weeks in intense therapy, intense group therapy. And we got out, started a Zoom meeting on a Wednesday night, and we've been meeting every Wednesday night for 2.5 years. And so we traveled around the country to connect with each other. 2 of the guys are in England right now. And those are my guys. Like, I have my community. And I cannot tell you how important that is on this journey for me. I would not be here. I would not have made it had it not been for that. I just wouldn't.
Right.
Transformation, in my mind, is a simple formula, but a very difficult process. It's the right information and the right community and time. That's it. But for men, to have other men listen to their emotions, it's foreign.
Well, and it's not one of those things. I mean, I'm not a man, but from my observations, it's not one of those things that just naturally happens in our society for men. Much more, this is where women have it easier because it's much more likely to happen organically without a concentrated effort for women because of how we're socialized and because of how we naturally tend to connect with other women. But for men, I think often it does have to be very intentional. And there's also, I think, a great deal of courage required to be willing to be vulnerable, to dig in. Like I know with some of the men in my life, what really holds them back, I think, is the fear of, like, if I open this Pandora's box, I know there will be no putting the lid back on, but I don't know what I'm going to find. I don't know what will happen next. There's a loss of control and this unknown factor. So talk to me a little bit about that, because I know there are some men listening who are thinking, oh, it sounds great, but like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I'll give some examples of some different kinds of men as well, because I have been described as, like, gentle. And so for guys who are not gentle, it's like, this is not for me. And so, well, let's figure that out. And I also want to talk about the age thing too, because some of my best friends are in their 70s. And when I met them, they were in their early 70s, and they were still trying to figure it out. And so the concept of, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, I'm like, no. If there's some cognitive thing in there, for sure, then you got to figure that out. But for people who are still functioning at a high level, no, that's not true. Not in my experience. I've watched it. I watched a 62-year-old man who was a retired firefighter, high lieutenant, strong man, manly man. I watched him in a psychodrama where we had to assign different people in our from our family of origin. We had to assign those roles to some of the guys. And it was really like, what is it you want to say that you've never been able to say? And I watched this, oh man, I'm going to get emotional saying it. I watched this dude pour his heart out to this guy that's representing his father and just let him have it. And, like, his father he taught him a lot of good things, but he was not emotionally available, and was just, there was a bunch of other stuff that happened that was real trauma. And I watched this dude melt to pieces. And he was different after that. Like, he's still strong, handy, but all the pain that he'd been carrying, he offloaded. And his whole demeanor shifted to where, like, that was the middle of the first week. By the end of the second week, we're like, dude, you are a different person. Like, I was afraid of him at first, where I'm like, this dude is, like, on edge. Like, and now he's just, like, his eyes are kind. he's strong, but he's tender. And I'm like, this is who you are. You haven't started the process of recovering yourself. And he doesn't mind me sharing his name. He has told me this. So his first name is Ed, but he does not go by Ed. He goes by Eddie now because he recovered his inner child. And so he's like, I am now Eddie. This is who I am. And I'm like, yes, that's who you are. And so I just want to address that where it's like, you're never too old. And the concept of courage is huge because it is a very, very brave thing. And part of it is that I think what most men need to realize is it's I'll use an example for myself. So with my trauma therapist, we do different trauma therapy techniques like EMDR, brain spotting, some common ones that are, for me, very effective. And I remember digging around in my past, and I remember telling him, I'm like, dude, I don't know what I'm going to find. Because like I took if you're familiar with, it's called the ACE score, Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a list of 10 questions of like things that have happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
And like my score is very high. And by statistics, I shouldn't be here because like I shouldn't be functioning the way I am because of just the reality of what those things can do to you. And so I knew this, he knew this, and I'm like, man, I'm afraid of what I'm going to find. And I remember digging around, and I remember finding this thing that I buried, like psychologically. And like it took months to create enough space to walk around it, and I finally opened it. And what I found was myself. I had buried part of myself that I was so ashamed of, that was full of beauty, poetry, a love for music, all things that didn't fit into my family of origin. And so I cut that off to belong.
Right.
And I was so ashamed of it. And so to guys that are listening, like I just want to let them know, like it does take courage to dig around and find what's in there. But what you're going to find is yourself. Because somewhere along the way, you had to lose parts of yourself to fit into your family of origin, to your culture, to your society, to whatever. And you exiled a part of you. And you've been longing for it ever since. And that's where addiction and other maladaptive behaviors come into play, because it's like I'm not my full self, and so I have to figure that out. So I just want to be clear about that, where it's like it does take courage, but I'm telling you, I wouldn't trade where I am for anything. The process was hell. But where I am,
yeah,
I wouldn't trade.
Yeah. That's I think I can safely say that most people who have been down this road would say the same thing. Like there's no way I would trade this for anything.
Nope.
So I want to get into some like specifics of how we start developing more emotional intelligence. But before we do that, I'd love for you to kind of paint us the before and after picture. Like sometimes we need a little motivation to jump in and do the work. So explain or illustrate for us what it looks like, what it feels like before, and what it feels like after we start doing this work and develop healing and developing this emotional intelligence.
Yeah. Okay. So before, I'll speak from my experience. Before, there is this. It's there's not a lot of room inside. So for me, there was apathy, there was some anger, and then just bodily urges of like sexuality, whatever. And that was really it. I was a shell. And sexual abuse and a lot of other things took these parts of me and broke them. And so for me, there was a lack of awareness. There was a lack of an ability to feel like I belonged in situations. There was this performer part that could keep surface level conversations going really easily, but I never felt like I was connected in. And one of the best questions that I was told to ask when I got home was I had to go to a couple different friend groups and ask them, what is it like for you to be around me? And just listen to their answer. And I know. I'm like, oh my. Okay.
Ouch.
Yeah. And it was all the same. and these friend groups didn't know each other, but it was the same thing. A lot of fun, enjoy you, don't really connect. And one guy was brutally honest, where he's like, "You are a parrot." I'm like, "What do you mean I'm a parrot?" And he's like, "You don't have your own voice. You just say what other people are saying."
Mm.
And I was like, now he was dead on, dead on. I have since recovered my voice, and I'm very thankful for it. And so that's what it was like before, where there was a desire to and longing to connect at a level where I'm receiving. And I was like a limbless tree. There was nothing for people to grab onto emotionally. And so the process of waking up emotionally and becoming more emotionally intelligent is painful, because my addiction and my ability to escape was all because I didn't want to feel my big emotions. I didn't want to deal with the traumatic events and the emotions around. So to start the process of getting language and sitting with those, it's painful. There's no getting around it. It is just painful, and it is hard. But in that, you start to develop not only tolerance, but you start to feel what are perceived as positive emotions, where it's like, I enjoyed that. Like, I liked that. I tried that and I liked it. So maybe I'll do it again. Or this conversation was good and I feel something inside in my body. So we feel our emotions in our body. Most men are not connected to their body. We live from our neck up. So along the way, getting reconnected with my body, and now I'm like, I know what I feel most of the time. And if I don't, I know who to call. Where I'm like, I got this thing going on and I'm not totally sure what it is. I need to talk it out. Now the running joke in our group from Colorado is, it's like on a Wednesday night, like last night, I'm like, dude, I got a lot going on. And I was just checking in of just things that are happening and feelings. And at the end of it, it was like, and it's just Wednesday. There's enough today for me to focus on. I can't go too far out to the future and what's called future tripping, which is I'm afraid of the future and I'm stressed out about my past, so I can't be in the present. I'm anywhere but here. Now I can anchor in and go like, no, there's enough good and bad to walk through. And I have the tools and the awareness to be able to walk through.
Yes, tools and awareness. Those are two very big things. So one of the things I think that happens especially in today's society, is that men, and sometimes women too, but especially men, often trade, or maybe trade is the wrong word, connect, or I don't know, you may have to give me the right word here, but wow, my words. Equate, there's the word I'm looking for. Sexual connection with emotional connection. Like maybe that's the only way they know how to make an emotional connection or to feel connected for a brief period of time. So speak to that for just a minute, because I think that's something that comes up a lot in these conversations is, my husband or my boyfriend or whatever doesn't really know how to emotionally connect with me. He just wants sex all the time. And I don't think that that's really about the physical act of sex. I think that's about a substitution for emotional connection that he's looking for.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's such a good point. And I actually had a client call today where we were talking about this exact topic. So there's a difference between intensity and intimacy, first off. And in general, in our culture, we chase intensity over intimacy because it's easier. Number one, it's much easier to just physically connect with someone. The reality in my mind, the way that I view healthy sexual connection, is that it's the spillover of emotional connection that is then represented in a physical act that brings it to another level. That's not just physical connection, right? Yeah. So that's the first thing is there's a difference between intensity and intimacy. And as men, particularly, it's very easy to confuse the two, where it's like, I do love you. This is how I'm showing you I love you, by making sure that you enjoy the act of sex. And it's like, sure, okay, fine. But the reality of what's going on underneath is an insecurity in the inability to communicate emotionally. And so we just try to figure out, well, this is the only way I know how to do this, so this is what I'm going to do, and I enjoy it, and you say you enjoy it, so let's do it. When in reality, I can't remember if we talked about this yesterday or not, but there's three things. We mimic what we model. And what is modeled for us typically is a combination of two things when we need a combination of three things. It's a combination of the father is the punisher and the father is the provider. Now, both those things are good. When I say punisher, I mean helping us to learn values, ethics, the reality of like guilt can be a very good thing when we do something wrong and we need to learn from it. Not abusing and punishing, but actually going like, no, this is how we act. Provider, providing a home, a place of safety. The third thing we need, though, is we need a pursuer. We need a man who pursues our heart, who pursues our mind, who pursues our interests, and who creates a space for us to be curious about ourselves. Now, the mother can do that and needs to do that. It's very good. But what the father does with that is typically it enhances the environment in a way that is not only safe, but can be connected with purpose. And that's very, very, very important. And so when we don't have that, we then just take on what we've seen. Again, just talking with a client without having to break confidentiality, who literally was like, I see my father in me, and I don't want to be like that. I don't want to just be a provider or a punisher. Like, I want to be a pursuer. And I'm like, right, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how to pursue your kids' hearts. Let's talk about how to do that practically. Pursue your wife. So we take all this stuff and we think that's all we need. But then we get into these situations where our wife or our partner is like, hey, I need more. And we're like, well, you're just needy. And it's like, well, maybe, or maybe you don't know that you're needy too in healthy ways, where maybe this is very unpopular opinion, but it's true. Maybe you need healthy, non-sexual physical touch. Maybe that's actually your love language. And your wife just putting her hand on you and saying, I see you, would cause something to happen inside of you that would stir with love. But all you know is sex. It's physical touch that leads to some form of sex. So it's a multi-layered thing where we confuse intimacy with intensity, where we think our spouse or our girlfriend or our partner is being needy, when in fact we probably don't know our own needs. And culture has a lot to do with it too, in terms of the model.
Right.
And so underneath what I would call smooth shame, I just did a whole thing on this yesterday. Smooth shame, which is like, it's a guy who has no problem pursuing or initially connecting with a woman, but long term cannot keep the relationship. It's because what has been modeled for him has been this combination of punisher and provider. But the substance to be able to go the distance in terms of like curiosity about who his girlfriend or wife or partner is, it isn't there because he himself is not curious about himself.
Yes. And as you're talking about this, I mean, you're basically describing my marriage, and what I see all the time in coaching women is this conversation comes up from the opposite perspective, and I just want to say, like, to the men listening, if you don't understand why your wife isn't interested in sex, it might be because of this right here. Like, there's nothing, I don't think, that is a bigger libido killer for wives than to be in this dynamic where their husband is trying to use sex to meet an emotional need rather than emotionally connecting and then letting that sexual intimacy be the overflow of the connection that you have together. So, okay, so let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about like some practical things. Like we've got men, we've got women listening here who are like, yep, I can really identify with a lot of what Mike is saying here. What now? Like, and I think we're both going to agree that having a coach or a therapist or a support group or whatever that looks like is critical. But like, what are some things someone listening to this can start working on or thinking about or doing right now to get them sort of started down this road?
It's an excellent question. Okay, so there's a couple things. Number one, um, if if you're in a space where you're hearing this and you're like, okay, I resonate with this, and I'm stuck, or I'm in a space I don't want to be, whatever that looks like. The first thing I would say is be curious. Be curious about yourself. And again, if you can't, I'm going to name it right here and now. It's shame.
Yeah. 100%.
I know a few things well, and I know shame really well. And so it's my radar for it. I can sniff it out almost every time with the guys I work with. Where I'm like, tell me about your shame. They're like, I don't have shame. I'm like, what is shame? I don't know. Okay, let me tell you what I think shame is. I go into the definition of shame, and they're like, oh. And I'm like, yeah, I can see it. I can smell it, man. Like, you are full of shame. And that's why there's no curiosity. Because you're afraid of what you'll find, because you're ashamed of what you'll find. All of it.
Right.
So first thing is be curious. If you can't be curious, it's your shame. So then the question from there is like, well, what do I do with my shame? And this is where courage comes into play. This is where courage, in my mind, it comes into play. Is you got to tell somebody about your shame.
Yeah.
Not some random thing. Someone trusted. But you got to get that out.
Yeah. Because bringing the shame into the light, speaking that out loud is such a game changer. Like, huge. And it doesn't even matter necessarily who you talk to, as long as it's a person who's going to not just shame you further or condemn you, right? As long as it's a safe person, there's something about speaking it out loud, getting it out of your head and out of your body, and putting it into words. I yes, 100%.
So the amount of guys that I start a conversation with, friends now over the past couple of years that I've been doing this, but then also clients who are like, I've never told anybody this. And I get excited, not just because it's like, okay, like I do feel honored, where I'm like, okay, you feel safe enough to say this. But I know what's on the other side of that.
Right.
It's a deeper breath. It's the ability to breathe a little bit easier where they're like, I feel better. It's not fixed, but it starts the process of offloading what's stored in your body and in your mind to come out. And the reality is that you carry that everywhere you go. Everywhere you go. We store these things in our body, in stress, weight gain, and lack of sleep, in anxiety, depression. All of these things are responses to our bodies being stressed out from what we're carrying. So first, be curious. If you can't be, it's shame. Like, what do I do with my shame? You tell somebody about it. Would be the first three things that I would say. And then from there, I mean, obviously, we're both in coaching, so we're biased to the reality of like coaching and therapy, for sure.
True.
But allow yourself to be curious with grace and space. And that's so hard because typically, I was reading earlier today, I was reading a book, and the account said that like only 18 to 30% of sexual abuse cases are reported.
Wow.
And I'm like, so that means that like anywhere from 7 to 8 out of 10 are not. Yeah. And if you grew up in some sort of environment where your family was like, we keep this in-house, which is very common. Right. And what they like to mean by that is, well, we're going to deal with it in-house, which means it never gets dealt with. And I'm like, so now you're carrying around all this shame of what has happened to you, and your innocence has been stolen, your voice has been stolen, and you need to learn how to reclaim those things, reclaim your soul, right? But that only happens if you're curious. And you need the grace and space in that process, because you're going to find things that just hurt. And the amount of guys I sit with where I'm like, I'm just going to sit here with you right now, because you have chosen courage to talk about this thing or these things that have happened. And I'm just going to sit here with you while you,
Yeah.
like, they're offload, and then to be able to sit with one guy in particular and be like, I know you don't believe this, but I'm going to tell you anyway, you're a good man. And just like, poof, the echo of that just broke him. And I'm like, you can't hold that right now, so I'll hold it for you. But the fact that you're here trying to change shows me that this isn't court order. You choose to be here. You choose to keep coming back.
Yeah.
And so be curious, deal with your shame, talk about it, and then find people who know how to affirm where you're trying to go, right? Like, right information, right community.
Yeah.
You need both. What we want to do is we want to take some 12-week course that's going to fix my addiction. And it's like, all that right information could be spot on. But if you don't have the community to walk with you through it, I promise you won't make it. Promise you.
Right.
And I wish that were true, but that's the way it is.
Well, and there's so many reasons for that, but one of them goes back to that shame thing. Like, if you don't have a place to share that, to sit with that, I think one of the biggest things that helps us overcome shame is to say it out loud and still be accepted.
Yes.
Right? Because shame thrives when it's secret. It's a self-perpetuating cycle, because our shame tells us to keep our shame secret, which then creates more shame. Speaking that is what breaks the cycle. Sharing that with someone is really what breaks the cycle.
Yeah.
So how does someone go about finding those people? How does someone identify who is that safe person, right? Especially for men, I think this is really tough. So someone who's listening going, I don't have anybody I can talk to.
Yeah.
How do you find someone safe that you can talk to?
Yeah.
Short of hiring someone like you.
Yeah. I wish I had a better answer than I do. Because this is something that constantly I am trying to search for, kind of a, not generic, but just kind of a, like an answer that's going to work for everybody. And the reality is that I don't think that exists, but there are some principles that you can look for. Number one, they know how to listen.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a lot of listeners left in our culture. We got a lot of people just speaking. It's one of the side effects of social media is that we believe that our voice is important to everyone. It's just not true. It's just not.
That's true.
We think it is. We think all 1,000 followers that I have on Facebook want to hear what I have to say. That's just not true.
Right.
So someone who can listen is huge.
Mm-hmm.
When I say listen, not just not talk, but like lean into the conversation, and they make you feel important in that moment. They fit. They're attuned, as we talked about. They're attuning to you. They're tuning to what you need, which is to just be heard and be seen. That's the first thing. And number two, I would say that they choose to express some level of vulnerability. So it's not a one-sided thing, because that's what I can do. That's what you can do as a coach, where like we may insert parts of our story if they fit, and that's fine, which is, I like the guidelines on coaching a little bit more, because they're a little more lax than, say, therapy, where you can kind of choose your spots. But overall, that's still a paid relationship. You need someone who's willing to share part of their life with you, where you're like, you get it. Even if it's different scenario, even if it's not fully the same thing, you have some understanding. Our right brains attune to the other person's right brain in a way where when someone apologizes, we can tell you don't do that.
Right.
Or
yes.
you do. It's the connecting point between right brain and right brain. And so it's a guy named Kurt Thompson, who is a doctor who studies interpersonal neurobiology, which is the study of relationships and how they affect the brain. Mm-hmm. And so all this stuff is happening that we have no idea. milliseconds, and it's
Yeah.
beautiful. And
Yeah.
so someone who is able to listen well, someone who shares some level of vulnerability, and this one's going to be an underrated one, especially for men, but I promise you it's important. Your body feels comfortable around
Yeah.
because your gut
Yes.
is associated with safety and protection, and the gut knows. It just, I can't even explain it, but I promise you the gut knows. And so if you
Right.
feel safe around someone, there's a good chance your body's like they're not a threat.
Right. And for someone who, and this was me, so speaking from experience, if you don't even know what your body's feeling or how to tune into that, you can start to pay attention to some physiological responses that your body's having. So, for example, if you walk into a space where this other person is and you feel your body sort of tighten up and your shoulders go up, that's the opposite of the safe feeling, right?
Correct.
If you walk into a room and your body sort of exhales and your shoulders drop, that's a good sign that that's a person that your body feels safe with.
Yes. That's the whole point, is the comfort level of the reality that your body's responding to what is perceived as a threat. And so that's where the tenseness comes up, and it's like, okay, like, what am I going to do? And then the reality of your body dropping and allowing issues that are internally going on of like, okay, like I can let this go because they're safe. Those are the things to pay attention to, is like, okay, what, like when I go into this room where I'm talking with someone, like, why am I tense? Why am I closing? Why am I feeling like I have to be on guard versus like opening up and just kind of relaxing, sitting back, and it's like I feel very calm. That is a sign of safety, for sure.
I completely agree with everything that you're saying about safety, how identifying those people. And one thing I would add, because this is what I see, is in my coaching practice, is finding someone who is comfortable sitting with pain, like sitting with big emotions, because so many people like the default reaction is when there's a big emotion, let's calm it down and cover it up, right?
Yeah.
And if you can find someone who is comfortable sitting with big emotions, that's another great sign that this is a safe person to talk to.
That's a really, thank you for saying that. And the other thing I would piggyback off of that is that most of the, at least with men, most of the men that I have found that can handle big emotions have had to do their own work in some way or another. And so it's a pretty good sign where it's like, okay, now I'm like, okay, if you can handle that, that means you've probably done some work to get to this point. And that's someone you want to be around.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I think it's going to be very helpful to a lot of people. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about specifics about what you do, coaching, and how someone can kind of connect with you, or maybe even just identify that they need to come and work with you.
Yeah. Thank you. So right now I offer 3 different paths for trauma-informed coaching. The first path is addiction/recovery path. It's part of my own story. It's what is birthed. It is birthed out of me. So like when I ask guys to walk that road, I've walked it. I'm still walking it. It's not just an idea. It's something that is directly tied to my story. The second path is the inner child path, which the first two can really be intertwined because you're typically doing some form of child or story work in addiction and recovery work. But for guys that may not have addiction issues that are severe, or they see some tendencies, they're like, hey, like this maladaptive behavior is just weird. Like I hit myself when I'm stressed out, or whatever it is. Like, okay, let's figure that out. Where did that come from? You probably weren't born like that. You learned to do that for some reason to regulate. So let's figure that out. And then the third one is just the trauma-informed coaching path, which is your standard coaching path of, hey, I just want to be the best version of myself I can be. I got some things I want to work on, not necessarily major trauma. Okay, that's fine. And as far as wanting to like identifying like working with me, you can't make guarantees. I mean, you know this. You can't make guarantees in coaching or therapy or anything like that. But I do say one thing as a guarantee. And my guarantee is that you will quit on yourself before I do.
Mm.
It's very simple. I will walk with you as long as you want to walk. And I will fight for your soul as long as you want to fight for yourself. If you don't want to walk, I can't walk your road for you.
Right.
But I will walk beside you. I will give you every tool I have. I will ask every question I know how to ask. And I will hold space for what's going on inside of you at the time. And so that's for me, that's what I guarantee is I'm like, you will quit on yourself before I do.
Yes. And the other thing I think that we can guarantee is that if you step into this and you do the work, you will not regret it. You will
Correct.
not come out on the other side of this journey. And not that it's ever finished. It's a process. It's an ongoing thing, but you're not going to do this work and regret it. I have yet to meet or see anyone who has jumped in, opened the Pandora's box, said, whatever comes, I'm going to deal with it because I want a healthier version of me. I want to be who I am. I want to be healthy. I want to show up in the best way for myself, for my family, for everyone around me. I know no one, and I doubt I will ever meet anyone who has done this work and regretted it.
Totally agree. I mean, the concept of recovery from addiction is sobriety, but that's the baseline. That's not the end. That's the beginning. What recovery really is, for me, has been the recovery of myself. The recovery of who I was before all the nonsense happened that I couldn't control, and then all the nonsense that happened that I could control and was responsible for.
Mm-hmm.
I'm recovering myself, and I love it because I love who I was made to be. I just didn't know that because I lost it along the way.
Right. Yeah, we get to a place where we don't even remember or have any idea who that healed person even is. And that is always a worthwhile discovery to make.
I agree. And last thing, for guys that are on the fence, number one, my website is www.wayward-coaching.com. I was a wayward soul. That's why I chose the word. I love that word. I was off the path. I had no idea how to get back. So I have experience in that. My email is mike@wayward-coaching.com. But lastly, for guys, if you're on the fence and you're like, I don't know if I need this or not, my only thing would be to just ask you, can you look at yourself in the mirror for 10 seconds without looking away?
Yeah.
Because if you can't, you got shame. And if you got shame, I can help you with that.
Yes. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for being here. If you've been listening and resonating with what Mike has been saying, go look him up at www.wayward-coaching.com. I will put all of his links, including his email address, in the podcast notes so that you can connect with him both on his website and on social media. Thank you so much, Mike. It's been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yes. Thank you for having me on and for what you're doing.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Equilibrium Echoes. If you would like to learn more about the podcast, visit www.coachingwithalyssa.com/podcast. And while you're there, book your free consultation and download the preview of my new book, Marriage is Hard and Other Lies I Believed. I'll see you in the next episode.